In my last video, I showed all the personal electronic devices that I carried with me on a recent international trip and explained why they seem important to me. Now I need to show you what's involved in keeping all those battery-powered thingies charged up. Those of you who travel with nothing but a phone may get some laughs out of this video because it's a bit complicated. But don't give up on me yet. All will become clear as we go on. Hi, I'm Gary. I make videos on technology-related stuff from a user point of view, and I hope you'll find them informative or at least interesting. This one may also be amusing, at least in the sense that sometimes you have to laugh at what happens to you to keep from crying. If you saw my last video, which is linked in the description by the way, you know it cataloged all the electronic stuff I took with me on a recent 3-week trip to Scotland and England. It was a pretty large pile, but I explained why all those things are worth it to me to lug around. Your list may be very different, but there's an excellent chance it shares at least one thing in common with mine. All those devices are battery-powered. So if your trip lasts more than a very few days, they're not going to be useful unless you can keep the batteries charged. That's pretty much the entire theme of this video. It doesn't sound like that ought to be a problem, does it? After all, you keep them all charged with no trouble at home, and it really isn't that hard. But there are some things worth knowing, or maybe avoiding, if you're leaving your home country and living out of a suitcase. If you're already an expert world traveler, most of this will not be news to you. But I do it infrequently enough now that even after 40 years of international trips and living abroad for 2 years, it's still possible for me to overlook something that creates a problem. For reference, and in case you haven't seen the first video, here is what I carried on the trip I mentioned. The things that need power are a laptop, 2 digital cameras, a phone, a power bank, a rechargeable flashlight, a music player and a set of headphones, a GPS watch, a video light, and 4 other things for my wife. Now, if you were keeping count, that amounts to 14 items between the 2 of us. Did we carry 14 chargers? No, we didn't, but it was still a bunch, as you can see here. The 2 music players and the headphones use non-rechargeable AAA batteries, so I won't say any more about them. It's easy to carry spares. Both the phones, the power bank, both GPS watches, my wife's Kindle e-reader, and the video light can all be charged from any USB charger that delivers enough power, as long as you have the right charging cable. So we carried a couple of USB chargers and the several different kinds of cables, because of course they're not interchangeable. The laptop has its own proprietary power adapter. The 2 cameras use different batteries and thus different chargers. And the flashlight also has its own, which at least does run off a USB power brick. So that's a half dozen or so chargers, plus an extra one in the checked suitcase just in case. And my wife likes to carry her own in her carry-on. By this point, you're probably thinking, surely there has to be a way to do this with a much smaller collection of chargers. Couldn't you get by with only 1 or 2 and a minimal set of cables? It turns out that the answer is yes, although I chose not to do that for reasons of my own. The secret is that many newer electronic devices can be charged from a USB charger, even if they normally come with something different. For example, my Samsung Note 9 laptop has 1 USB-C port on it, and while the manual doesn't say so, I've verified that it can be operated and charged through that port if, and this is a big if, your USB charger will deliver 45 watts or more. Phone chargers won't do that. You need a big honkin' one like this one, which is actually a 65-watt unit. It's theoretically capable of supplying 45 watts for my laptop from its USB-C output, while also providing 18 watts from the other output for charging phones, or whatever. I bought this before my trip, so why didn't I use it? The answer is that it actually weighs more than my laptop power supply, and I hadn't owned it long enough to trust it for critical use yet. I certainly wasn't going to carry it and the laptop one as well. As it happens, both my cameras can also be charged through their USB ports. So why lug along 2 more separate chargers for them? Well, I can put up with most any kind of problem on a trip as long as I come home with my photos. There's no way I'm taking chances with that. Charging a camera battery in the camera typically takes much longer than using a separate charger, and you probably can't use the camera while you're doing it. Also, I had 5 camera batteries because the small Sony ones run down very quickly. So for me, the in-camera charging idea was only a backup in case I had to do 2 at once for a camera. Which actually raises a question. What do you do if you need to charge several things at once, even if you do have all the chargers needed? Because we typically do sightseeing much of the day, which means at least 3 or 4 things will probably need to be charged or at least powered in the evening. If you're staying in hotels or B&Bs, you're likely to be limited on the number of available electrical outlets, at least without crawling behind the bed or the furniture. It's not as much of a problem in the cottages or apartments we usually rent, but it's still a mess to have stuff scattered everywhere. There are a couple of ways one could deal with this. The obvious one might be to use a multi-port USB charger, maybe even something like this Giganticus one. It would handle pretty much anything as long as you had the space and the right connecting cables for it. I wouldn't do it personally, because I'm a great believer in redundancy. The phrase putting all your eggs in one basket comes to mind here. But if you're willing to take the risk, it would certainly simplify things as long as all your devices can be charged by USB. My approach is simpler. I just carry a small power strip that lets me plug multiple chargers into a single electrical outlet. The only catch is, if you're a North American, you need to be sure it's rated for the higher voltage electrical systems you may find in other countries. For example, I bought this one before my trip because it has 9 outlets and 3 USB ports, while not being horribly large. But it turns out to be rated only for 125 volts, which means it's not usable anywhere in Europe, most of Asia, and much of South America. So, buyer beware. That brings me to the thing that is probably most confusing to novice international travelers, the different power standards across the world. Various countries use pretty much every combination of either 50 or 60 hertz frequency and a voltage in either the 110 to 130 volt or 220 to 240 volt range. That's the easy part, because most modern electronic devices have power supplies that will operate anywhere in those ranges without having to change anything. But those different countries also use a bewildering number of different electrical receptacles for plugging your devices into, of which there are at least 15 so-called standard ones, cleverly named Type A to Type O. This color-coded map shows which countries use which type, or types. A few countries use 2 or 3 or 4 different ones. If you want to see which countries use which, you can look them up on a website like this one. So what you need are plug adapters like these to convert the plugs on your devices to the receptacles that are used where you're going. Here's my collection from over the years. If you're only going to one country, it's not a big deal. Just buy the right one. For example, almost all of Europe uses this Type C one, sometimes called a Euro plug. But the United Kingdom, along with many former parts of the British Empire, uses this Type G one instead. They're bigger and bulkier than most, which is why I packed mine in my checked luggage for my recent trip. Then when the airline lost my luggage, thank you British Airways, I had to go shopping for more. Do not do this. The ones you need can be hard to find at your destination. UK residents rarely need US plug adapters, for example. And they won't be cheap either. You can buy an entire multi-country set on Amazon for the price of getting one locally. That points out one of the disadvantages of my approach to chargers. I had all my chargers with me in my carry-on, but I needed to find multiple adapters so that the three of us could charge more than one device at a time. I will give you one obscure bit of information that helped us out when this happened to us. Have you ever wondered about the outlets in hotel bathrooms that are common in Europe and sometimes in other countries as well? They're marked shavers only. These are low-power outlets that are electrically isolated, so you can't electrocute yourself in the bath, but they're limited to only a few watts of output, about 40 watts in the UK, for example. You can usually plug either a US or a Euro plug in them, and they provide enough power to charge a phone or some other small electronic device. Do not try plugging your laptop or your hairdryer in them. You will blow a fuse. I'll give you one more bit of advice about this. If you look for plug adapters on Amazon or in a travel store, you'll see a lot of so-called universal adapters. They have multiple prongs that slide in and out to fit various kinds of receptacles, usually the European, US, UK, and sometimes Australian variants. I've been on trips with people who took them, and I would personally recommend against using them. They're bulky and expensive, the slide-out pins are prone to jamming, they're not truly universal, and some of them may be even unsafe. And if you need several of them, you may need another suitcase. Just buy the ordinary ones, whether individually or in a set. Sometimes simpler is actually better. This video has actually turned out to be longer than I anticipated. My goal was just to raise your awareness of things you may need to consider if you carry your personal electronic devices on an international trip. If you've stuck with me to this point, I hope you liked the video. See what I did there? Like the video? Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. And thank you for watching.